Hey friends, tonight we're taking a slow, meandering walk into one of the lesser-known footnotes of medieval life, the fine and rather foggy art of getting high in a time before modern pharmacology, social stigma, or frankly, standardized measurements. Now, before we open the shutters and let in the gentle waft of belladonna and boredom, take a moment to fluff your pillow, turn down the lights, and maybe settle in under a blanket that hasn't been fumigated with medieval mothballs. If you've had a long day, or even a medium one, this might be the perfect moment to let your eyes relax and let your mind drift off into a world where people smeared themselves with pig fat and henbane and called it spiritual enlightenment. Let's ease in. We begin in a very normal, very lumpy corner of the 14th century English countryside, in a hamlet that is never named because no one bothered to name it. It had a road of sorts, a pig that belonged to no one and everyone, and one modest apothecary who was respected, tolerated, and feared in equal measure. Her name was Agatha. She was 54, which was practically ancient by local standards, and exactly the right age to know which plants might kill you, which might help you sleep, and which might make you see your grandfather juggling turnips, even if he'd been dead for 18 years. Agatha's hut smelled strongly of rosemary dust and moral ambiguity. Inside were shelves upon shelves of jars, pouches, and suspiciously greasy bundles. There was no order to any of it, at least not one visible to the human eye. But she knew where everything was. Dried henbane. Top, left behind the cracked bowl with the carved goose. Powdered mandrake. Root bottom shelf. Second jar from the left labeled Caution Dream Soup. And if you were looking for something truly transformative, say a thick green ointment that promised nothing and delivered everything well, that was kept in the box beneath the firewood next to her emergency shoe. Today, as the sun lifted over the thatched roofs and the morning air carried the cheerful groans of someone stepping barefoot onto a snail, Agatha prepared her tools. She had an order to fill a discreet one. The village reeve's wife had been hearing bells and seeing colors that refused to stay inside their lines. Agatha suspected stress, or possibly just marriage, but she nodded gravely and promised a remedy that would soften the edges of one's mind, like smoothing a particularly wrinkled cabbage. Into the mortar went a careful scoop of dried henbane leaves, followed by a drizzle of belladonna tincture thinned with mead, and a whisper of foxglove. Not enough to stop the heart, just enough to make it question itself. As she ground the mixture, she hummed an old tune about dancing sheep and dreamed briefly of an extra blanket for winter. It was shaping up to be that kind of morning. Outside, the village was doing what it did best, almost nothing, and doing it slowly. Chickens wandered into arguments. Men pretended to fix fences that had never existed. And a child attempted to trade a pebble for a piece of turnip. No one noticed, as a thin, nervous man in an ill-fitting hood made his way up the path to Agatha's hut, clutching something wrapped in cloth. His name was Arnold, and he was the sort of person who could walk through a crowd and leave no impression whatsoever, like fog or certain types of soup. He was here on business, or something like it. Agatha looked up as he arrived and greeted him with the exact amount of enthusiasm required to stay polite. "Ah, Arnold, come to forget your thoughts again?" Arnold nodded. He did that a lot. "The dreams are back," he whispered, "and the cows still judging me." "Well," Agatha said, "at least someone is." She handed him a small satchel, the same mixture she'd given him before, but with a little more mandrake, this time just to round out the corners. "Rub it on your temples, the soles of your feet, and anywhere else you don't mind hallucinating from. Stay near a blanket, and don't argue with any talking doors." Arnold paid her in 2 buttons and a piece of dry cheese. It was a fair trade. Arnold left Agatha's hut with the care of someone transporting ancient eggs, or possibly vague regrets. The small satchel, clutched in his hand, gave off a smell somewhere between overcooked spinach and damp linen that had developed ambitions. As he walked, the wind picked up, slightly tugging at his hood and swirling lazy dust devils across the narrow village lane, as if the air itself was bored and had nothing better to do. The journey back to his cottage took approximately 12 minutes, or slightly longer, if you counted the 3 times he paused to let passing chickens assert their right of way. His home was modest, as expected, wedged unconvincingly between a crumbling stable and a patch of nettles that had outlived several generations of local goats. The front door was made from reclaimed barn wood, which gave it a delightful tendency to close at its own discretion, usually in the middle of someone entering. Inside, Arnold's cottage was a monument to minimal effort. A lopsided table, 2 stools of varying height, and a fireplace that had ideas above its station. His prized possession was a woven blanket patterned in what he claimed were celestial symbols, though most visitors agreed looked more like an accident involving wine and a confused hedgehog. He settled into his stool, the slightly shorter one that squeaked like a small existential crisis, and laid out the contents of the satchel with great ceremony. A pinch of the ointment went onto each temple as instructed. Another onto the soles of his feet, though getting there required more flexibility than he strictly possessed. For the final step, he hesitated. "Anywhere else I don't mind hallucinating from," he muttered. He opted for a dab behind each ear, just in case the hallucinations were sound-based. The effect was not immediate. Medieval herbal blends took their time. They didn't rush. They unfolded like old books or arguments about bread taxes. Arnold sat and waited, watching the flames in his hearth stretch and yawn like tired cats. The room remained mostly quiet, save for the occasional groan from the roof beams and the distant sound of someone losing an argument with a wheelbarrow. Then the fog began. It wasn't the damp, clinging mist of an autumn morning. This fog had opinions. It crept under the door with purpose pooled at the base of the table and climbed the furniture like it was inspecting it for dust. Arnold blinked. The corners of the room began to blur slightly, not in a menacing way, but in the way certain thoughts do when you're not sure if you've actually had lunch or just thought about it really hard. He rubbed his eyes. The fireplace now seemed larger than it had any right to be, with the flames stretching far higher than the chimney should allow. From within the hearth, a voice emerged, slow, thoughtful, slightly nasal. "You've returned, Arnold." He stared. "I have." "You never really left," said the fire. "But also, you did. Time is confusing." Arnold nodded solemnly. He agreed. He didn't know with what, but he agreed. As the flames danced, shadows formed on the wall, twisting into shapes that looked vaguely bovine. The cow. It was back. Not the real one from his neighbor's paddock, the spectral one from his dreams. It stood in the middle of the foggy floor, ethereal and unimpressed. "You again," Arnold muttered. The cow blinked. Arnold bowed because it seemed like the thing to do. "Oh, mighty spirit of cud and contemplation, what message do you bring?" The cow said nothing, as was its custom, but it did point a hoof, a ghostly, flickering hoof, toward the door. Arnold turned. The door had vanished, replaced by an archway made of moss-covered stone. Through it, he could see a courtyard bathed in moonlight, even though it was only afternoon. The moon was visible, hanging far too close, as if it had leaned in to eavesdrop. He stepped through. The courtyard was familiar, and not like an old song hummed by a stranger. The ground was tiled with uneven slabs, each one carved with what appeared to be tiny shouting faces. A fountain bubbled gently in the center, spouting something that shimmered like dreams poured into water. Around him stood a series of cloaked figures, their faces obscured by shadows and foliage. One of them stepped forward, holding out a scroll. Arnold took it, expecting a riddle, or perhaps a recipe. Instead, it read, "You are now technically a part-time owl." He looked up, confused. The figure nodded. "Congratulations." Arnold blinked again. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. Or possibly laughed. The moon tilted slightly, like a wink, and then the courtyard began to dissolve, crumbling at the edges like old parchment in a too-damp drawer. The cow mooed once softly. Not judgment this time, possibly encouragement. And just like that, he was back in his cottage. The fire crackled. The stool squeaked. The ointment still tingled faintly behind his ears. He looked around. Everything was as it had been, almost. There were feathers on the windowsill. White ones. Possibly owl-shaped. Possibly not. He stood stretched and muttered, "Might need to reduce the mandrake next time." But somewhere in the back of his mind, the fog hadn't entirely cleared. The courtyard still waited. And the cow, wherever it resided, had not said goodbye. By the following morning, though, to be honest, the concept of morning felt more like a suggestion than a certainty. Arnold awoke with a head full of cotton feathers and an inexplicable craving for beetroot. His blanket had migrated during the night, coiling around one ankle like a sleepy ferret. The fireplace had gone out, replaced by the sort of ash that suggested something dramatic had once happened, but no one could quite remember what. He sat up slowly. A feather drifted off his shoulder, pirouetting to the floor with the grace of a dancer paid in oats. He wasn't entirely sure what day it was, but he was quite sure the cow had told him something. Something about the moon, or owls, or was it taxes? Either way, he felt that today required a walk, possibly to clear his head, possibly to find it. He wrapped himself in his second-best cloak, the one that still had a button, and shuffled out into the quiet grayness of early village life. The fog lingered lazy and curious, winding around fence posts and hiding chickens with no apparent urgency. Somewhere, someone was already arguing with a goose. All was well. Arnold didn't have a destination. He rarely did. His feet carried him beyond the edge of the village, past the leaning milestone that hadn't pointed anywhere since the plague year, and into the low fields where the hedgerows whispered secrets to passing beetles. He paused beneath one particularly thick hedge that had, for reasons unknown, begun to hum softly. There was a rustling, a snort, and then, quite suddenly, a man fell out of it. Well, not a full man. More of a man-shaped collection of scarves, twigs, and philosophical choices. "Ga," said the bundle, untangling itself with the elegance of a collapsing wardrobe. I was listening. Arnold blinked. To the hedge. The man looked affronted. It's very chatty before lunch. You must be Arnold. Arnold hesitated. I might be. Excellent, said the scarf bundle. That makes things both easier and marginally less disappointing. The man introduced himself as Finnegan of the Dandelion Fold, which was not so much a name as a botanical statement. He wore 12 layers of clothing, all of them the wrong color for his complexion, and had the sort of beard that grew in defiance of grooming. He also carried a satchel full of what he claimed were items of metaphysical interest, one of which turned out to be a potato with a face drawn on it in charcoal. I've heard, Finnegan said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, that you've been to the courtyard. Arnold tried not to look surprised. I may have stepped through a moonlit arch in a possibly imaginary door. Finnegan nodded. That's how it begins. He pulled out a scroll not dissimilar to the one Arnold had received from the cloaked figure. This one, however, read, "The hedge remembers all." Arnold tilted his head. Does it? Oh, yes, Finnegan said. Especially things it wasn't supposed to hear. That's how I knew to find you. You used the ointment, didn't you? Agatha's blend. Belladonna mandrake, foxglove, a whisper of wild thyme, and pig fat, Arnold added. Very tingly. Indeed. The classic conduit. Finnegan rifled through his satchel and produced a tiny glass vial filled with bluish powder. Now that you've crossed the threshold, there are rules, responsibilities, possibly a quiz. Arnold frowned. Am I in trouble? Finnegan shook his head. No, not yet. But the cow has noticed you. Arnold's eyes widened. You've seen it, too. Oh, yes, Finnegan said. The watcher of grazing thought. It guards the courtyard, keeps the line of lucid tillage from fraying. Very picky about newcomers. If it pointed you toward the door, it means you've been marked. Chosen, even. Chosen for what? Finnegan leaned in. That's the part we're still working out, but it probably involves walking sideways at some point. Arnold, who had spent most of his life avoiding attention, even from vegetables, was understandably hesitant. I just wanted to forget my dreams and stop hearing my bread talk to me. That's usually how it starts, Finnegan said, nodding sagely. But now that your mind's been softened, the world can get in more easily, and not just the world you can see. Arnold looked down at the blue powder. What's that A stabilizer? Finnegan replied. Ground poppy seed, dried moss from the whispering stones, and powdered chamomile. Keeps the edges from curling. Might even help you sleep through the crow choir. I hate the crow choir. Most do. They sat in silence for a moment, watching a particularly bold squirrel steal half a turnip from an unattended basket. The fog thickened, curling protectively around the two men, like a blanket with too many opinions. Finally, Finnegan stood. "You'll need to prepare. The courtyard isn't always patient. You'll be summoned again. Next time, it may ask questions. And you'll want to have answers that don't involve breakfast food." He turned and vanished back into the hedge, leaving behind a single acorn and the faint scent of roasted fennel. Arnold sat alone for a long time, the scroll still in his hand. A bird flew overhead. A sheep bleated somewhat judgmentally. In the distance, back toward the village, he could just barely hear Agatha humming. And the cow, he was quite sure, had begun to smile. Arnold didn't return home right away. He sat for a while under the whispering hedge, trying to make sense of what had just happened, not with urgency, but with the slow, resigned manner of someone sorting buttons that may or may not belong to shirts he never owned. The scroll Finnegan had given him lay in his lap. The hedge remembers. All it read in curly ink that smelled faintly of plum and regret. He sighed. "I don't even remember what I had for supper." The cow had smiled. That was true. Finnegan had vanished into shrubbery. And now Arnold was left with a warning, a dusting of blue powder, and the unsettling feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, his afternoon naps were no longer his own. The village lay quietly in the distance, doing what it always did, existing with minimal ambition. Smoke curled from chimneys. Someone was trying to build a ladder using only one rung, and stubborn optimism, and from the central square came the gentle thudding of a dispute over whose goose had trespassed onto whose turnip patch. Arnold, craving something simple and unsymbolic, decided to visit Agatha. Her hut was exactly where it always was, and yet it somehow felt farther away. Possibly because the road was now meandering slightly to the left, even though it had never done so before. He chalked it up to weather, or fate, or a slightly over-enthusiastic mole. Agatha was in the garden when he arrived, bent over what appeared to be a very disgruntled fennel plant. She straightened as he approached, wiped her hands on her apron, and gave him the kind of look reserved for people who've just wandered in from a vision quest and might still be partially on one. "Back so soon?" Arnold nodded. The ointment worked. A bit too well, perhaps. There was a cow. Again. And Finnegan came out of a bush. Agatha didn't blink. That tracks. She motioned for him to sit on the bench beside the carrot barrel. It was a modest seat, mildly warped, and home to at least one beetle colony. Arnold sank into it with the grace of someone expecting a splinter and receiving too. "You've crossed over," she said, rummaging through a basket of dried leaves and scrolls. "That means the hedge folk have marked you. They don't visit just anyone." "I didn't ask to be marked," Arnold muttered. "No one does," Agatha replied. "But you rubbed the ointment, didn't you? That was consent enough for them. They're terribly old-fashioned that way." She pulled out a small, wrapped bundle and handed it to him. It was warm and smelled faintly of mushroom and sadness. "What's this?" he asked. "An anchoring meal," she said. "Buttonroot stew with calming mushroom and just a dash of turmeric for flavor. Eat it before nightfall. It'll help keep your dreams from unzipping." Arnold held the bundle like it might unbundle itself. "What happens if I don't?" She shrugged. "You might wake up on top of a church spire, or inside a very opinionated fog. One never knows." He set the stew down beside him and looked around the garden. It was the same as always, overgrown inexplicably, humming in places, and entirely free of straight lines. But he noticed something new. On the far wall behind the shelf of potted regrets, and near the jar labeled "Toads Mildly Cursed," there hung a calendar. Only it wasn't a normal calendar. There were no numbers, no months, no saints' days or festivals, just symbols. A crescent moon, a spoon of fish with legs, a broom floating above a chair. He pointed. "What is that?" Agatha followed his gaze and smiled faintly. "Ah, that's the Dream Keeper's ledger. It tracks visitation windows, visitation times. When the boundary between here and the elsewhere thins," she explained. "When the courtyard opens its gate, and you're most likely to be summoned." Arnold stared at the symbol, currently pinned to the top. It looked like a turnip wearing spectacles. "That's tonight," Agatha nodded. "Yes, the scholar's root phase. Rare, thoughtful, often brings puzzles." Arnold's eyebrows tried to retreat into his hairline. "I don't do well with puzzles." "No one does," she said. "That's why the courtyard likes them." She stood, brushed dirt from her hands, and walked to the apothecary shelf. After a moment's thought, she returned with a vial filled with what appeared to be starlight and anxiety. "Drink this before sleep," she said. "It's a pre-fog clarity draft. Keeps your thoughts from wandering too far ahead of your feet." Arnold accepted it with the solemnity of someone who had once tried to drink willow bark tea and ended up hallucinating an argument between two spoons. As he prepared to leave, Agatha paused him with a gentle hand. "One more thing. If you see the Watcher again, the cow ask it about the 9th bell." "What's the 9th Belle. No one knows. That's why we keep asking. And with that, Arnold shuffled back to his cottage stew in one hand, vial in the other, and his mind gently unraveling like an old scarf near a campfire. The sky above him had begun to turn that odd shade between dusk and philosophy, and the air smelled faintly of time and anticipation. He reached home, locked the door behind him, and set the stew on the hearth. It bubbled softly, as if muttering to itself about the price of mushrooms. The courtyard would come again. That much was certain. But whether it would bring answers or just more cryptic livestock remained entirely unclear. That night, Arnold lit exactly 3 candles. No more, no less. It wasn't a superstition exactly. It was just that the last time he'd lit 4, his cupboard had politely rotated itself to face the wall, and no amount of apologizing had made it turn back. So 3 it was. He placed the vial from Agatha on the table, next to the bundle of buttonroot stew, which had now cooled into a polite lump with ambitions to become a pudding. The stars had begun to show through the little hole in his wall that served as both window and weather monitor. Outside, the breeze played a cautious tune through the thatching, and inside, everything was suspiciously quiet. Arnold sniffed the vial. It smelled faintly of eucalyptus and something he could only describe as library. He sipped it, then waited. At first, nothing. Then a sensation like a small door creaking open at the back of his mind. Not forcefully, just enough to let a draft through. He settled into bed, if one could call a slightly flattened straw pile, and a blanket with a personality bed, and tried not to think about cows, which of course meant he immediately thought about cows. The room shifted, not violently, not with a bang or a swirl. It just reconfigured itself slightly, like a shy butler adjusting the silverware. The candlelight flickered, the air thickened, and the shadows grew legs. And then the bell rang. It wasn't loud. In fact, it barely qualified as a sound, more of a suggestion. A single soft tone, low round, and curiously wise. Arnold sat up. The room had vanished. In its place was a hallway made entirely of pale stone, each slab etched with markings he couldn't quite read, but felt he had once seen on the back of a spoon. At the far end of the hallway, a figure waited. The Watcher. It stood calmly, massive and still, its eyes twin pools of steady bovine contemplation. No judgment this time, only expectation. Arnold approached with the reverence one reserves for bishops sleeping dogs or strangers holding scissors. "I heard the bell," he said. The cow blinked. That was the 9th. Another blink. Arnold fidgeted. Am I supposed to do something? The watcher turned its hooves, echoing softly, and led him down the corridor. They passed doors, dozens of them, each labeled in a different style of calligraphy, none of it familiar. One was made entirely of moss. Another looked like a biscuit. A third was slowly leaking what appeared to be opinions. They stopped at a door shaped like a teacup. Is this a metaphor? Arnold asked. The cow didn't answer. It never did. The door opened. Inside was a room. A normal room. Astonishingly so. There was a chair, a fireplace, and a small table upon which sat predictably a teacup. Arnold stepped in, and the moment he did, the door vanished. The cow did not follow. The room was cozy, warm, and only mildly unsettling. The teacup, however, was watching him. He could feel it. Cautiously, he approached. It was a plain cup. White, a bit chipped, but otherwise unremarkable. Except that it whispered. What is the question? It said, in a voice like dry leaves brushing against memory. Arnold blinked. Pardon, the 9th bell? The cup said. It rings not for answers, but for proper questions. I don't have any proper questions, Arnold admitted. Only improper ones. Like, why do cows know things? And what happens if you sneeze in a dream? The teacup sighed. That's something. Arnold sat. The chair was remarkably comfortable, suspiciously so, like it was trying too hard. He stared into the cup. It was empty, but inside swirled colors, not visible colors exactly, but the feeling of colors. Melancholy teal, ambitious ochre, slightly embarrassed mauve. He leaned in, and the room rippled. Now he stood in a field, not quite his field, not quite any field. The sky was pink, but not a cheerful pink, more of a pink that had been told to behave itself. The wind blew sideways, and in the distance, a group of people wearing hats shaped like punctuation marks were singing to a rock. The watcher was beside him. This is a test, isn't it? Arnold said. Silence. Am I supposed to ask something? Still silence. He looked around. The people were now forming a line. One of them held a large carrot, as if it were a torch. Another was holding what might have been a hymn book or a recipe for boiled socks. Then he saw it in the center of the field, a table. And on the table, the teacup again. He walked toward it. As he reached it, the wind stopped. The singers paused. The watcher sat. He picked up the cup. What am I supposed to understand? The cup replied without moving. Only what you forget. And with that, everything folded inward, like a map being reluctantly closed by someone who suspects it might still be upside down. Arnold awoke. He was back in bed. The candles had gone out. The vial was empty. But on the table sat a teacup, chipped plain, unmistakable. And beside it, a slip of parchment with one word, soon. Morning came with all the grace of a dropped spoon. The sun, if it could be called that, peered through the window hole like a nosy ant shedding light on the small, utterly ordinary cottage, where on the table a chipped teacup sat beside a scrap of parchment that read in thin, dreamy ink, "Soon." Arnold stared at it the way one might regard a talking door with mild respect, and the hope it would eventually explain itself. He didn't remember falling asleep. He did remember the field, the cow, the odd song, and of course, the teacup that knew things it had no right to know. But it was the word soon that troubled him most. Vague, ominous, not nearly specific enough for a man who once got lost walking to his own backyard. He reached for the cup. It was cool, ordinary, as inert as anything that had previously whispered cryptic advice in a swirling field of reality distortions could be. He turned the parchment over. Nothing on the back, just the faint imprint of the table's wood grain, as if the word had leaned there a long while, waiting for him to wake up. He set it down and rubbed his face with both hands, muttering something about non-committal prophecy, and maybe I should have been a cobbler. Then he stood, stretched, and promptly stepped on something soft. A parsnip. There was a whole basket of them by the door. He hadn't put them there. Tucked into the pile was a folded note sealed with wax shaped like a turnip in a wig. Arnold frowned. He opened it. Arnold. The time has come to clarify several things, confuse several more, and possibly consume soup. You are hereby invited to the market of mist, held every third fog following a ninth bell. Come, clothed curious and moderately well-rested. Sincerely, the Committee for Interplanar Etiquette and Root, Vegetable Trading. He read it 3 times. Each time it made both more and less sense. The handwriting changed slightly between paragraphs. He looked at the parsnips again. They were fresh dirt still clinging to them, as though they'd been yanked from the earth by someone in a mild hurry. One of them was shaped suspiciously like a duck. He took that one as a sign of what he didn't yet know. Outside, the village had not changed, which was, in its own way, deeply unsettling. After dreams of cosmic cows and cryptic teacups, He had half expected the sun to be square or the chickens to recite poetry. But no. The same geese chased the same children. The same gossip drifted through the square, carried on the wind like breadcrumbs dropped by a very indecisive baker. Arnold headed for Agatha's. She was outside again this time, attempting to teach her herb pots to respect personal space. They weren't listening. The basil had started encroaching on the thyme, which had retaliated by wilting dramatically. She looked up as he arrived. "Ah, you've met the teacup." Arnold sat down on the bench before she invited him to. "It told me to remember what I forget." Agatha nodded. "They're always saying things like that. The teacup division is big on memory, less big on calendars." "There was a note this morning," Arnold said, producing the invitation. "And a basket of parsnips." Agatha took the note, sniffed it, and held it up to the light. She said. "That's their official wax. Root division. Slightly eccentric, even by courtyard standards, but harmless. Mostly. Is there an unofficial wax?" "Oh yes," she said, "but it tends to scream." Arnold blinked. She handed him a small jar from the shelf, emotional bracing salve, and pointed him to a cushion shaped like a disappointed melon. "You'll need to prepare. The market is a place of bargains, some literal, some metaphysical. Everyone trades something." He frowned. "I don't have anything." "Not yet," Agatha said. "But you will." From a dusty corner, she pulled a large book titled "A Modestly Illustrated Guide to Trans-Dimensional Commerce, Beginners, Binding Edition." She opened it to the first page, which read simply, "Try not to stare directly at the prices. They'll notice. Markets open between 3rd and 4th fog." She continued flipping to a page filled with sketches of stalls made of bones, books, and possibly cheese. "You'll need a token of passage, something personal, but not sentimental, and ideally not flammable." Arnold looked down at himself. "What if I'm only carrying self-doubt and a bread crust?" She considered. The crust might work. They spent the afternoon in quiet preparation. Agatha gave him a coin made of dried plum leather, a cloak stitched from someone else's, dreams washed twice, and a small whispering compass that only pointed to things you didn't know you'd lost. By evening, the fog had thickened into what the village called a proper super, the kind where the trees went missing and the ducks forgot who they were. It was time. Arnold stood at the edge of the lane, cloak, fastened satchel, gently snoring at his side, and compass twitching gently toward the unknown. Agatha nodded. "Follow the fog until it starts humming. Then turn left at the 3rd regret. You'll see a lantern shaped like a fish. The entrance is just beyond it. He hesitated. What do I do when I get there? She shrugged. Shop? Trade? Listen. Ask the wrong question to the right stall keeper, or the other way round. But whatever you do, don't touch the hats. And with that, Arnold stepped forward. The fog thickened around him, warm and oddly lemon-scented. His compass twitched. The path curved. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang once, soft, inviting. The market of mist waited, and Arnold parsnips, and all was on his way. The fog didn't just thicken. It acquired intent. It curled around Arnold's boots in a manner that felt both encouraging and mildly judgmental. He walked carefully, relying on the twitching of the whispering compass and the faint hum that now buzzed beneath the air like a nervous cello. The direction was vague, but the instructions had been clear enough. Follow the fog until it hums, turn left at the third regret, and look for the lantern shaped like a fish. The regrets were harder to count than expected. He passed what may have been one and a half buried memory of a misspoken farewell, the other the time he'd thrown out a perfectly good shoe because it looked at him funny. The third was unmistakable, a stone marker carved with the words, "You probably should have written that down." He turned left. The humming grew louder. Then the lantern. It dangled from a crooked pole, swaying without wind, shaped unmistakably like a trout wearing spectacles. Its glow was not light exactly, but memory. Arnold stepped toward it, and the world changed. One moment fog, the next the market. It unfolded all at once, like someone had opened a pop-up book of impossible places. Stalls stretched into the mist, each one cobbled together, from nonsense and nostalgia, tents stitched from old bedtime stories, counters made of half-remembered lullabies, signs that shimmered with script, only readable if you'd once had a very specific dream about alphabet soup. The air buzzed with negotiation whispers, and the occasional polite sneeze from a mushroom wearing spectacles. Overhead, the sky was purple, not in hue, but in temperament. It felt purple. Arnold clutched his satchel and stepped forward. The first stall sold moods. Jars lined the shelves, each labeled in swirly script. Tuesday optimism, acceptable melancholy, caffeinated euphoria. The vendor, a lizard in a waistcoat, offered him a sample, but Arnold politely declined. He was already carrying enough feelings as it was. Next came a booth stacked with clocks, all of them ticking out of sync. The sign above read, "Timepieces for non-linear personalities." The merchant was asleep in a hammock, gently snoring in Morse code. Further in, a woman with feathers for hair was bartering riddles for potatoes. Arnold watched as one particularly smug-looking tuber was traded for the answer to "What do chairs dream about when no one is sitting?" Arnold wandered. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that the compass had gone quiet, and the fog had agreed to give him some personal space. Then he saw it, tucked between a stall selling second-hand déjà vu and another specializing in suspiciously sentient gloves, was a tiny tent with a flap made of smoke and old parchment. Its sign read, "Memories misplaced or mildly misfiled. Inquire within." He entered. Inside was dim and warm. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars, books, folded napkins, and small boxes tied with string. Each one pulsed gently like a sleeping heartbeat. Behind a narrow counter sat a figure. They wore a cloak made of post-it notes and spectacles with no glass. Their hands moved constantly, dusting, labeling, rearranging. Without looking up, they spoke. "You've lost something." Arnold hesitated. "Have I?" "We all have," the figure said. "Some lose moments, others years. Some just misplace the feeling of what it meant to be 10, and absolutely certain that frogs were magic." "I might have forgotten where I put my best sock," Arnold offered. "Not quite what we handle here." The figure reached beneath the counter and withdrew a box, plain small, humming faintly with anticipation. "This one had your name on it." Arnold blinked. "I didn't give my name. You've been here before." "In a way." The box vibrated slightly. Arnold opened it. Inside, a single feather, a whisper, and the faint sound of bells. A memory flooded in. He was small, very small. Perhaps 5. Sitting in a garden. Not Agatha's, not his own. Somewhere else. There had been someone reading. A voice full of comfort and warm bread. And a Crispo, of course, standing nearby, with its head tilted, listening to the story as if it had editorial notes. He blinked. "Who was that?" he asked. The figure shrugged. Some questions only lead to other questions. Arnold looked again. The box was now empty. Or perhaps it had always been. The memory settled somewhere behind his eyes, like a cat claiming a windowsill. "Why do I remember that now?" "Because you needed to," the vendor said. "The market gives what is asked, and sometimes what is forgotten to be asked." Arnold set the box down. "I don't have much to trade." The figure nodded. "You gave a parsnip on the way in." "I did." "You thought it was a toll." "It wasn't, but it was accepted." He turned to leave. "One more thing," the vendor called. "If you reach the courtyard again, tell the watcher the teacup knows." Arnold turned. knows what. But the stall was empty. He stepped back into the market. The fog had thickened again, but this time it curled around him like a cloak that mostly meant well. The path had changed. It now sloped gently downward, lined with lanterns, shaped like punctuation marks, and the occasional philosophical chicken. He didn't know where it led. Not yet. But the watcher was waiting, and Arnold, cloaked in mystery parsnips, and at least one rediscovered memory, was ready to walk on. The path that wound through the market of mist no longer pretended to be logical. Arnold found himself walking on cobblestones made from softly humming eggshells beneath a canopy of paper lanterns that whispered apologies for things they hadn't done. The fog swirled companionably around his ankles, offering neither obstruction nor encouragement, just presence, like a cat with ambiguous motives. He wasn't sure how long he'd been walking. Time in the market didn't pass so much as loiter. But eventually, he reached a fork in the road where a signpost stood, or rather, slouched. It was topped with a weather vane shaped like a startled hat and decorated with directional arrows pointing to places such as this way, maybe over, there don't ask, regret, avoid, if possible, and simply left. Arnold squinted. A small voice, raspy and slightly out of breath, drifted down from the hat-shaped weather vane. You've come too far to turn back, and too early to arrive. Arnold tilted his head. You can talk. Only on Thursdays, the vane said, and market days. You're fortunate. I need to find the courtyard again, Arnold said. The Watcher. I've got a message. The vane spun slowly. That way, it said, pointing all 4 arrows toward a narrow arch made of moth-eaten curtains and academic anxiety. And take this. From somewhere above, a string unraveled and lowered a pouch into Arnold's hands. It was warm, soft, and filled with something that smelled faintly of chalk cinnamon and unresolved philosophy. What is it? Philosopher's tea bag, the vane replied. Steep it in thought. It'll brew clarity, or at least confusion with better manners. Arnold tucked it into his satchel. Thank you. The vane shrugged, which was impressive given its lack of shoulders, and resumed spinning in slow, uncertain circles. Through the curtain arch, Arnold emerged into what could only be described as a waiting room for forgotten concepts. Chairs sat in pairs, arguing softly in upholstery. A long table bore a placard, "Please wait until called. Do not rearrange the clouds." One cloud hovered above a coat rack and made polite, burbling noises. Arnold sat. A moment passed, or perhaps a week. Time here was on break. Then a bell rang, Not the ninth bell, but a cousin of it, and a door opened. A figure waved him in. She was tall, cloaked in map fragments, with eyes like old library cards. She said nothing, but beckoned. Arnold followed. They walked a corridor lined with windows, each one showing scenes from other dreams, other moments. A child laughing in a storm. A baker falling in love with the scent of flour. A goat attending a lecture on fence-jumping ethics. The corridor ended in a small room. There, on a pedestal, sat the teacup. Arnold blinked. "You again?" The teacup shimmered. "Me always." "I went to the market," Arnold said. "I found a memory. Someone said to tell you the teacup knows." The teacup did not reply. It simply rotated once in place. Then the floor beneath Arnold shifted. Not in a collapsing sort of way, more like a polite suggestion to move downward. He sank gently into darkness that smelled of old parchment and citrus. When the sensation of movement stopped, he was somewhere new. The courtyard. Only now it was different. Gone was the moonlit serenity of before. This time, it was midday, or a version of midday, that didn't follow the rules. The sky overhead flickered between lavender and brass. The stones beneath his feet hummed with anticipation. And at the center, grazing near a fountain that wept sideways, stood the watcher. The cow looked up as Arnold approached. He bowed slightly. It felt right. "I have a message," Arnold said. "The teacup knows." The watcher blinked once, then turned. A door appeared in the air, a perfect rectangle made of mismatched wood and tangled questions. It opened without sound. Inside, a study, shelves filled with jars, scrolls, feathers, and a large jar labeled "Loose Time Unrolled." The watcher stepped aside. Arnold entered. The room was warm and dusty, not just old, but tired. A fire burned in a hearth that hadn't been built yet, and in the center, seated in a chair that looked suspiciously like a folded piano, was a person. They wore no cloak, no crown, no mark of office, just a simple robe and a scarf that changed color when not directly observed. "Arnold," they said, not as a question. He nodded. "Please sit." He did. "I am the steward," the person said, "of this courtyard of its doors and its deeper questions." Arnold swallowed. "And I'm—" "What?" "A messenger." Perhaps the steward said. "Perhaps more. You've been marked, visited, remembered. You've stepped through doors not meant for most, And you've met the teacup. Arnold nodded again. It asked me what I forgot. That's what it does? The steward leaned forward. Do you know why the Watcher chose you? I was just trying to stop the dreams, Arnold said. Exactly. The steward smiled. You weren't seeking answers, just rest. That makes you safe. Arnold furrowed his brow. Safe for what? The steward didn't answer. Instead, they opened a drawer in the wall, and withdrew a small stone carved with a spiral. This is your token now. It opens a door that does not yet exist, but will. Soon. Arnold held the stone. It was warm, but uncertain. The steward returned to their chair. There is one more place you must go, they said. One more fragment to find. And then, perhaps, things will almost begin to make sense. Arnold sighed. Of course. Outside, the courtyard began to shift again. The ground re-threaded itself. The fountain spun once counterclockwise. And in the distance, a bell began to ring. The bell rang once, then twice low, thoughtful tones that echoed without origin. Arnold stood in the shifting courtyard stone in hand, staring at the steward, who now seemed less like a person and more like a memory in the act of remembering itself. The spiral stone was heavier than it looked, not in weight exactly, but in possibility. Holding it felt like clutching an unopened letter from someone who knew too much and had chosen their words carefully. The steward gestured toward a gently curving path that hadn't been there a moment before. It was lined with hedges shaped like questions marks and statues of people halfway through shrugging. Follow the path, the steward said. At the end, the stone will show you the door. And what's behind it? Arnold asked. The steward tilted their head. Potential, which wasn't comforting, but also not unexpected. The path wound gently paved with tiles that occasionally hummed snippets of lullabies in a language that might have been spoon-based. The air was cool, scented faintly with thyme and theoretical soup. Arnold walked with the slow, deliberate steps of someone trying not to startle a metaphor. Each hedge he passed whispered softly, not in words, but in tones, amused, distracted occasionally, vaguely disapproving. He passed a pond that reflected not himself, but a chair. Just one. Wooden, sturdy, sitting alone in a field of something that was trying very hard not to be cabbage. He kept walking. Eventually, the path opened onto a clearing, or something that resembled one, if a clearing could simultaneously exist indoors, outdoors, and in a dream about attics. In the center stood a plinth. The stone pulsed gently in Arnold's hand. He approached. There was no door, just the air waiting. He looked down at the spiral. It glowed softly, then dimmed, then glowed again in rhythm with something distant. Maybe a breath, maybe a drum, maybe a turnip, trying to be helpful. He held it up, and the door appeared. It didn't slam into place. It didn't shimmer with magic. It simply resolved, as though it had always been there, and merely required someone to notice it correctly. It was made of old wood, mismatched panels, and dreams not quite lived. In the center was a small keyhole shaped like a sigh. Arnold had no key, but the stone pulsed again, and the door clicked open. Inside, the space was dark and soft, not empty, but uncommitted. It was filled with things that hadn't happened yet. Possibilities hung from the ceiling like lanterns flickering with might-have-beens. The floor shifted beneath his feet like memory reconsidering itself. At the far end of the room was a desk. Seated at the desk was a person, or possibly an idea wearing a person-shaped coat. They looked up as Arnold approached. "Ah," they said. "Arnold, at last." "Everyone keeps saying that," Arnold muttered. "I didn't know I was late." "You're not," the figure said. "You're precisely when you're supposed to be." "But we've been waiting anyway." Out of habit. The room began to shape itself around the conversation. Shelves appeared stacked with books titled things like How to Recognize a Metaphor Before It Bites and Why Bread Shouldn't Talk Back. A cautionary tale. "You've brought the spiral," the figure said. Arnold nodded. "Good," they said. "That means the foundation is stable, or at least politely confused." "Who are you?" Arnold asked. "I'm the archivist," the figure replied. "I keep track of the in-betweens, the nearly happened, the almost said." They opened a drawer and pulled out a map, or rather a suggestion of one. It was blank, except for a small red dot labeled "You Mostly." "You're very near the axis," they said. "Is that dangerous?" "No. It's inconvenient. Things tend to loop," Arnold sighed. "That checks out." The archivist pointed to a small jar on the shelf labeled Temporary Certainty. "You'll need that," they said, "for what comes next." Arnold took it. It felt light and suspiciously agreeable. "And where do I go now?" The archivist pointed to another door. This one arched faintly, humming and outlined in threads of gold regret. "Through there," they said. "It leads to the library of seldom read truths. You'll find a name there. Not yours, but one you'll recognize." Arnold opened his mouth to ask more, but the room began to unravel. Not destructively, just politely receding, like a dream trying to let itself out without waking anyone. The archivist smiled. "You're doing well, you know, for someone who started out trying to silence his dreams." And then they were gone. And Arnold stood before the next door, spiral stone quiet, in his pocket jar of temporary certainty in hand, and more questions than socks. The handle turned itself, and the library waited. The door swung open with a sigh. Not the loud, dramatic kind that announces tragedy or spilled soup, but the kind of quiet sigh a tired curtain makes when it realizes it's Tuesday again. Arnold stepped through. The library of seldom read truths was much taller than necessary, and mildly disappointed with itself. It stretched in all directions, upward, sideways, emotionally, its shelves filled with books that pulsed softly with half-remembered ideas. The air smelled of paper rain and a faint trace of reluctant responsibility. Arnold hesitated. The jar of temporary certainty vibrated gently in his hand, like a polite cough from a mentor who doesn't want to interrupt, but has serious thoughts about punctuation. The room, though vast, felt personal, as if each step he took might summon another corner or corridor. The shelves had names, not titles, but actual names. One was labeled Clive. Another said, "Martha again." Several refused to be named and instead wore small signs that read, "Not today." He wandered. Books shifted as he passed. Some opened just a crack, offering glimpses of paragraphs that wobbled in tone. One shelf leaned toward him and whispered, "Try aisle 6.5 under things left unsaid." He followed. The aisle was narrow, carpeted with old to-do lists and memories of misplaced tools. Here, the books had long, complicated titles, like Chronicle of Minor Decisions that changed everything, slightly, and footnotes to forgotten weather patterns. He turned a corner and found a single lectern spotlighted by a shaft of not quite light. On it sat a book. The cover was blank. Arnold approached. The jar in his hand gave a final tremble, then settled. He placed it gently on the floor. The book opened on its own. There were no words, only a single page. At the top, in delicate ink, was written, "This page was never meant to be read." Beneath it, faint impressions, the shadows of letters, like a memory of writing. Arnold leaned closer, and suddenly he was somewhere else. He stood in a room made entirely of parchment. The walls fluttered when he breathed. A desk sat in the center, and behind it, a figure who looked suspiciously like the teacup, except taller, and wearing spectacles shaped like ampersands. Ah, the figure said. "You've found the page." Arnold blinked. It wasn't easy. Nor was it supposed to be, the figure replied. Truth, you see, is not something to be hunted. It's something to be interrupted. Arnold sat because the chair behind him insisted gently that he do so. "I was told I'd find a name here," he said. "Not mine, but one I'd recognize." The figure nodded. "And you will. But first, a question." Arnold braced. The figure steepled their fingers. "Do you remember the first time you lied to protect someone?" Arnold frowned. "That's a bit sudden." "It's the name." Arnold closed his eyes. A memory surfaced, faint, foggy, but clear enough to feel. He was young. Agatha's garden. A broken jar. A loud noise. A promise made. It was me, he'd said, though it hadn't been. It had been her apprentice, a girl named Elswith. He opened his eyes. Elswith. The room nodded. "That's the name," the figure said. "You'll need it." "Why so?" "Because she's the one who holds the other spiral." Arnold's mouth went dry. "There's more than one." "There are three," the figure said. "Yours opens doors. Hers opens memory. The third, well, we'll get there." Arnold sat back. The walls rustled gently, sympathetic. "Where is she?" he asked. The figure suckled, or perhaps frowned. It was hard to tell, with a mouth shaped like irony. "She's been looking for you, too." And then the parchment room folded in on itself. Arnold was back in the library. The book was closed, but this time it bore a title, Elswith, Keeper of the Forgotten Spiral. Arnold picked it up. It was warm. The jar at his feet began to glow again faintly. The shelves sighed, satisfied. And somewhere, maybe outside, maybe inside, a bell rang once. But not the 9th. Something else. Something older. And Arnold, book in hand, turned toward the next corridor. Arnold stood in the aisle of the Library of Seldom Read Truths, still clutching the book titled Elswith, Keeper of the Forgotten Spiral. It was heavier than it should have been, though not in the usual sense. This was the kind of weight one might associate with unspoken conversations, dusty promises, or a particularly long letter that began with "Dear You." It's complicated. The book didn't open, not by force, nor by pleading. He tried knocking on it gently once. It remained closed. The jar of temporary certainty beside him gave a soft glug of encouragement, then burped quietly and settled into a more philosophical temperature. Arnold looked around. The corridor had subtly changed. The books on the shelves now wore titles that stared back at him. How to Lose Track of Someone. Carefully echoes of Elswith and mistakes you made that weren't entirely your fault. Volume 3. He turned a corner and found a hallway lined not with books, but doors. Each door bore a brass plaque. One read, "A memory of Elswith's laughter." Another, "The day the jar fell." The third, simply, "Don't open unless absolutely necessary." Arnold, of course, opened the second one. It was late spring, or at least pretending to be. The garden buzzed with the kinds of bees that minded their own business, and the occasional herb that gossiped. Arnold, younger, slightly more hopeful, crouched beside a jar shattered on the cobblestones. Agatha's voice, distant and unsurprised, carried over from the doorway. What happened? Before the real culprit could speak, Arnold's voice jumped forward. "It was me," he said. "A lie. Small. Immediate. Kind." Elswith, just behind the rose bush, exhaled in relief. Agatha had nodded slowly, then said something about consequences and broom handles, and life had moved on. But in this moment, this small, quiet slice of past, Arnold saw the weight of the spiral beginning to curl. He stepped back from the memory. The hallway returned. Arnold took the book under his arm, gathered the jar, and moved forward. The next corridor was darker, narrower, lined with mirrors that didn't reflect him, but versions of him, some with spectacles, others with a different hat, one with suspiciously confident eyebrows. A voice whispered, "Arnold." He froze. The voice wasn't his. It wasn't the teacup, the watcher, or even Agatha's ever-patient sigh. It was hers. "Elswith," he whispered. The mirrors stilled. Their images shimmered a lining. And then one showed her. She looked older. Not old, just refined by time. Her cloak bore moss at the hem. Her hands held a spiral stone of darker hue, etched deeper. She stared out, not at him, but past him, as though watching something just to his left. "Where are you?" Arnold asked. She didn't answer. Couldn't, maybe. It was just an echo. But her mouth moved. Slowly. Carefully. The words formed in his mind. Find the red door. The mirror faded. He pressed on. The halls changed, now lined with winding staircases that led nowhere, whispering banisters, and one helpful ghost named Marjorie, who offered directions in riddles about soup. Eventually, he found it. The red door. Small, round, very much not trying to get anyone's attention, which, as it turned out, made it stand out more. He knocked. The jar of temporary certainty vibrated. The door opened. Inside, a room of spirals, some carved, some painted, one woven into a rug, that looked like it didn't want to be walked on. In the center, a chair, empty. But beside it, on a pedestal, shaped like a question, sat a letter. He opened it. Arnold. If you've found this, you remember. Or enough of you does. I've waited. I'm still waiting. The third spiral is waking. Meet me where the fog forgets itself. He folded the note carefully, as one might a piece of paper that remembered being a bird. The fog beyond the red door thickened. Not ominous, just expectant. The next step wasn't marked, but Arnold now knew where it led. He stepped into the fog, and the red door vanished behind him. The fog was thicker here. Not heavy, not suffocating, just extremely indecisive. It swirled as if trying to remember which way was which, and whether it had ever agreed on a direction in the first place. Arnold walked slowly, one cautious step at a time, the letter folded neatly in his pocket, and the jar of temporary certainty tucked under one arm like a particularly patient loaf of bread. He had no path, only intent. The air around him pulsed gently, not with noise, but with the sense that something was almost about to be understood. The silence was thoughtful, unfinished, like a sentence that keeps adding commas to avoid ending. Arnold exhaled. The fog parted slightly. Ahead, a bench, just a simple bench, carved from wood that had clearly been second-guessed, polished by years of waiting. No plaque, no cushion, just quiet invitation. And on it, Ellsworth. She looked up before he could speak. Her eyes were tired, but bright, like a lantern that refused to stop flickering, despite the wind's insistence. She smiled, not the dramatic kind that ends stories, but the small, necessary kind that starts the next line of a very long letter. You made it, she said. Arnold sat carefully. The bench creaked, not in protest, but in mild acknowledgement. I didn't know if you were real, he said. I'm often not, she replied, but lately I've tried to show up more consistently. Helps with letters. He handed her the folded note. I found this from you. She nodded. I wrote it a long time ago. Or maybe tomorrow. Things are fuzzy. They sat in silence for a while. The fog settled around them like a blanket trying to be helpful, but not smothering. A distant bell rang, unsure whether it was the 9th or merely early. Arnold cleared his throat. They told me you had the second spiral. Ellsworth reached into a pouch and pulled it out. It was smaller than his, darker, etched with tighter loops. It pulsed faintly. This one remembers, she said. It holds pieces we dropped. Arnold looked at his own. Mine opens doors. They all do, she replied, but to different kinds of places. They sat again in silence. Then softly, Elswith asked, Do you remember why you lied for me? Arnold nodded slowly. Because I saw how scared you were, and because I could. She smiled. That was the first time I noticed you weren't just a nervous boy with too many thoughts and a weak grasp on left and right. He chuckled. I still get those confused. She reached into her pouch again and pulled out a third item, a slip of parchment shaped like a question. This is the key to the third spiral, she said. Arnold frowned. There's a third. There's always a third, she said. Ours are memory and passage. The third spiral is convergence. He blinked. That sounds inconvenient. It is, spectacularly. But we're meant to meet it. All three of us. Who's the third? Elswith sighed. That's the trouble. The third spiral doesn't belong to someone. It belongs to something. The fog around them thickened briefly. Shapes stirred. One resembled a spoon. Another resembled a regret with poor posture. Arnold took a breath. Where do we go? Elswith stood. We walk. The bench vanished behind them with the faintest sigh of relief. The path did not appear. They simply moved. The fog shifted aside just enough to let them pass, but never far enough to offer a view. The ground beneath them became less path-like and more conceptual, like walking on ideas, or a to-do list abandoned mid-thought. As they walked, Elswith spoke. I've been trying to find you for ages, but you kept forgetting. I didn't mean to, Arnold said. I know. That's how forgetting works. They paused by a tree that was also a lamp-post, depending on perspective. A small creature, possibly a loaf of bread, wearing spectacles, watched them from beneath a leaf and nodded once, very solemnly. You've changed, she said. So have you. Wasn't on purpose, she added. Me neither. They walked on. Eventually, the fog began to thin. Not vanish, just become more transparent about its confusion. Light filtered through in long, lazy beams. The air smelled of stories just barely forgotten. Ahead, a structure. Not quite a building. Not quite a ruin. It was made of door frames and thresholds, windows without walls, stairs that spiraled both up and in. Arnold stopped. What is this place? Elswith looked up at it. It's called the Convergent Archive, where the spirals meet. where they decide what if we go forward. The building pulsed, and a new voice echoed, not a person's voice, but a place's. It said simply, "Present your spirals." Elswith held hers up. Arnold held his. The fog held its breath, and a third spiral shimmered into view, larger, older, suspended between thought and consequence. Arnold stepped forward, and the archive door swung open. The door opened without a sound, though everything about it suggested it ought to creak ominously, or at least mutter something cryptic. Instead, it simply allowed. The kind of open one encounters in a late chapter, or a drawer you forgot was empty. Arnold stepped inside first. The third spiral still hovered in the air behind them, as though unsure if it wanted to join, but reluctant to miss anything important. Elswith followed her boots, echoing gently on a floor made of forgotten footnotes and politely rearranged timelines. The convergent archive was larger on the inside, not in the dramatic, physics-defying way one might expect from magical buildings, but in the quiet manner of places that collect possibilities. It stretched upward into darkness, speckled with what might have been stars or overdue memories, and every surface pulsed softly with unspoken questions. The spiral stones, hers, and the one that had appeared between them began to glow. Not brightly, just enough to remind anyone watching that they were still very much here and had opinions about how things might go. In the center of the vast space stood a pedestal, or rather a suggestion of one. It shifted slightly as they approached, adjusting its height and decorum in accordance with their self-esteem. Above it hovered a lens, not glass, but memory distilled into shape. It reflected nothing and everything. When Arnold looked into it, he saw a chicken he vaguely remembered from childhood. When Elswith looked, she saw herself writing something she hadn't yet said. A voice, not from the lens, but through it, spoke. "You carry spirals. State your convergence." Arnold blinked. "We don't really have a plan," he admitted. Elswith stepped forward, more confident. "He carries the passage. I carry the memory. And that," she gestured to the third spiral, "carries the binding." There was a long pause, a thoughtful one, the kind that smells faintly of old maps and meetings that ran over schedule. "Then you are seekers. And this is your question." Before them, the lens expanded. The room fell away. They stood on a bridge made of decisions not taken. Below, swirling fog, layered in half-truths and alternative Tuesdays. Across, another version of the archive. Dimmer. Forgotten. Cracked by misuse. In between, a figure waited. Not cow, not teacup. A person, clad in robes that shimmered like reflections. A face both familiar and never seen. When they spoke, it sounded like pages turning. Arnold. Elswith. Arnold leaned in. Do we know you? Not yet. But you will remember me. Elswith gripped her spiral tighter. Are you the keeper? The figure nodded. Of the third spiral. Of what might have been. What is this place? Arnold asked. The keeper stepped aside. Behind them stood a wall of mirrors, but not for reflection. Each held a possibility, some dim, some bright, all waiting. In one, Arnold had never lied about the jar. In another, Elswith had never left Agatha's garden. In yet another, they'd never met at all, and the spirals had remained scattered unused. This is the hall of Almost the Keeper said. The convergence chooses what to hold and what to forget. Arnold frowned. And what happens if we choose wrong? There is no wrong, the keeper said. Only wait. Elswith stepped forward. We didn't come to choose futures. No, the keeper agreed. You came to remember why it matters. They pointed to the farthest mirror. In it, a village much like Arnold's. Quiet. Normal. Except the fog never lifted. The dreams never stopped. And no one remembered to ask why. That's what happens when spirals stay apart, the keeper said. Arnold swallowed. We fix that by merging them. The keeper nodded. You converge them. Memory passage and purpose. That is how clarity begins. A pedestal rose from the floor. Upon it, a bowl plain and undecorated. Place them here, the keeper said. One by one, they did. First Elswith's, then Arnold's, then the third. The bowl accepted them, with no flash, no bang, just stillness. Then a pulse. It radiated outward through the bridge, through the archive, through Arnold's feet, and into his thoughts. He saw himself, younger, then older, then neither. He saw Elswith, laughing, leaving, returning. He saw Agatha stirring a pot of something herbal and possibly forbidden. He saw the watcher blinking slowly beneath a sky made of choices. And then silence. The spirals now fused, lifted into the air, and from them a key fell, small, wooden, etched with the shape of a door that had not yet been found. Arnold picked it up. The archive dimmed. The keeper smiled, and a door appeared. This one real, physical, with hinges and possibility. Arnold looked at Elswith. Shall we? She smiled. Of course. We're almost done, not beginning. He turned the key, and the door opened. The door opened onto a space that wasn't quite a room, and not quite an idea, though it resembled both on a good day. The walls, if you could call them that, were composed of warm tones, and the smell of fresh parchment, with the ceiling barely visible above a soft haze that smelled vaguely of almonds and cautious ambition. Arnold and Elswith stepped through. Immediately, the door vanished behind them with a whisper that might have been good luck, or possibly bring snacks next time. Before them stood a single object, a chair. Not any chair. The chair. The one Arnold had seen earlier, reflected in the pond that didn't reflect him. Plain. Wooden. Utterly unremarkable. It sat alone in the middle of the room, bathed in a glow not from any light source, but seemingly from its own deep commitment to being exactly what it was. Arnold stared. "I know this chair." "You should," Elswith said gently. "We both sat in it once." As she said it, the room flickered, and then, quietly, the past unspooled. The walls faded into images, a small cottage. Agatha's voice in another room. Two children, side by side, elbows on knees, waiting for consequences. "I didn't break the jar," young Elswith had said. "I know," young Arnold replied. "But I'll say I did. She's already less mad at me than she is at your herbs." Then silence. A moment shared. The kind of silence that became a hinge. Back in the present, not present, the chair remained unchanged. The room pulsed gently. Not impatiently. Just ready. Elswith gestured to it. "It's a place of beginning. You must sit." Arnold approached slowly. As he sat, the room shifted again. Suddenly, stars above. A map unfurled around him. But it wasn't a map of places, it was a map of moments. Some tiny, some grand, all Arnold's. His hand on a doorknob, a cup of tea, the first dream with the cow, the parsnip that looked like a duck, Agatha's sarcastic salve jars, the teacup, the fog, the not-so-random market, and Elswith standing, sitting, laughing, vanishing. Arnold exhaled. "I didn't forget," he said softly. "I just let go for a while." And now, Elswith said, placing her hand gently on the spiral hanging at her side, "We hold it again." The room shimmered. Around the chair, 3 paths unfolded. Not roads, not corridors, possibilities. Each labeled with a single shifting word: return, restore, reveal. Arnold stood. The spirals now faintly merged into one, hovered between them, and the room waited. The three paths before them shimmered lightly like options offered by a very polite universe. Each was barely distinct from the next, not in shape, for they were all made of suggestions and metaphor, but in tone. The path marked return, hummed faintly, like a familiar song almost remembered. Restore pulsed gently, like the promise of a soup pot being stirred in another room. And reveal flickered erratically, as if unsure whether to speak or listen. Arnold looked at Elswith. I don't know which to choose. That's expected, she said. None of them are right, but all of them are necessary. How can that be? Because the spirals weren't made to answer questions. They were made to keep them company. Arnold frowned in that thoughtful, understated way he often reserved for overly complex door latches or jam labels written in Latin. He stepped toward return. The path warmed underfoot. Not like fire, more like memory, like the floor of a room you haven't been in since you were small, but that still remembers you. Elswith nodded. That one leads back, but not the way you think. The spirals hovered between them, then gently divided again, not into three, but into layers, like pages of the same letter written at different times. Arnold took one, Elswith another. The third remained hovering, watching, perhaps waiting. Together, they stepped forward. The path opened into a meadow. It was not the one from his dreams, nor the one behind Agatha's cottage, but something adjacent. A version of both combined and rearranged, as though compiled by a well-meaning librarian who'd misplaced her notes but remembered the general gist. Grass swayed gently in a wind that had nowhere else to be. The sky above was a sort of thoughtful gray, like it was giving rain a moment to reconsider its plans. In the center of the meadow stood a tree. Arnold recognized it immediately, though he couldn't have named it. The kind of tree you saw once as a child, forgot entirely, then dreamed about in passing decades later. Elswith exhaled. We buried something here. He blinked. We did? She knelt by the roots, brushed away some leaves, and uncovered a stone box. I remembered it just as we stepped through, she said. Not in the usual way, in the spiral way. Arnold knelt beside her. They opened the box. Inside, 3 objects. A small piece of chalk, a folded map shaped like a rabbit, and a cracked mirror wrapped in string. Elswith picked up the chalk. This was for drawing doors. Arnold took the map. And this? What's this for? She shrugged. We made it for a place we hadn't found yet. They stared at the mirror. It reflected nothing. Arnold touched it, and the sky around them shuddered. Suddenly, they stood in a version of the village, not the real one, but one built from stitched memory and cautious longing. It was close enough to be familiar, far enough to be strange. A chicken walked by, holding a philosophical expression. The wind carried the scent of a mistake someone had forgiven. Arnold looked down. The cracked mirror was gone, but the spiral in his pocket pulsed. Ellsworth pointed toward a building that was and wasn't Agatha's. "We need to go in." Inside, the furniture was arranged in the exact order of someone's thought process. A teacup rested on a shelf above its usual spot. The chair sat in the middle, no longer alone now, accompanied by another smaller, as if waiting for conversation. On the table, a folded note. Arnold picked it up. "If you've returned, it means you chose not to forget again. That is both admirable and inconvenient. The next step will not be familiar, but it will belong to you." He handed the note to Ellsworth. She smiled. She always knew too much. They sat. The chairs sighed in unison. The room dimmed, not darkened, just relaxed. A place comfortable enough to speak without expecting applause. Arnold reached into his pocket, pulled out the spiral, and set it on the table. It hummed. From behind them, the wall creaked open. Not a door. Not quite. But a possibility. Beyond it, a tunnel of stories not yet told, and a sound faint but certain, a cow softly chewing somewhere deep within. The creaking wall, which had once believed itself a shelf, or possibly a forgotten coat rack, now yawned open like a sigh, remembered mid-dream. Beyond it stretched a tunnel, long gently sloping and dimly lit by what appeared to be small glowing commas suspended in midair. Arnold stepped in first, the spiral stone gently pulsing in his pocket, like a pocket watch that had opinions. Ellsworth followed her steps, perfectly synchronized with his, though neither of them had planned it that way. The tunnel wasn't built of stone or brick, or even metaphor exactly. It felt more like history, soft-edged, slightly crinkled, and full of awkward footnotes. The air carried the scent of things not yet decided, and possibly a hint of cabbage, though Arnold hoped that part was just him. As they walked, the walls began to murmur. Not loudly, just little fragments, snippets of conversation, moments never finished. And then I said to the bread, "If we hadn't lost the left boot, maybe the outcome. Do you suppose clouds ever feel bloated?" Ellsworth paused by a particularly enthusiastic whisper. "This one sounds like it's trying to remember its own beginning." Arnold listened. It was something about socks, betrayal, and possibly a lute. He nodded. This might have been one of mine. They moved on. The tunnel shifted underfoot, not uncomfortably, more like an agreeable boat that occasionally adjusted its opinion on gravity. The glowing commas blinked slowly as they passed their light, now tinged with anticipation. Eventually, the path opened into a chamber. It was round. Not perfectly just enough to suggest the room had once seen a diagram of circles and done its best. At the center stood a table. Not remarkable in itself, but upon it rested something familiar. A teacup. Arnold squinted. You again. The teacup shimmered faintly. It did not speak, but its silence was extremely articulate. Ellsworth approached it with reverence. He doesn't remember everything she said gently, as if to the cup. The teacup rattled once, not in anger, more in agreement. Arnold stepped forward. I've been following the spiral. The third one. It led us here. The teacup tilted, and then, without ceremony, a door opened on the far side of the room. Through it came a sound, a low, thoughtful moo. Arnold froze. Ellsworth grinned. She came. The watcher stepped through. She was larger than Arnold remembered. Or perhaps the room had simply gotten smaller to accommodate her. Her eyes were as patient as ever. Her hooves clicked gently on the floor each step, an essay on the virtues of pause. Arnold bapshida slightly. Watcher. The watcher blinked once, and then spoke. In English. Her voice was warm hay and candlelight. You've returned. Arnold blinked. You talk. I always did. You just didn't stay awake long enough to listen. Ellsworth laughed. That tracks. The watcher walked slowly around the table. You've brought the spiral to the tunnel. That means the convergence has begun. Arnold frowned. Is that good? It is, the watcher replied, but only if you don't stop now. She turned her head and looked at Ellsworth. You remember the field of agreements? Ellsworth nodded. That's where we almost made a deal, and where you left something behind, the watcher said gently. Ellsworth sighed. A promise. I forgot it on purpose. The watcher nodded. And now you must choose whether to reclaim it. Arnold turned to her. What kind of promise? Ellsworth looked down at her hands. To come back. To stay. Arnold felt the words settle in the room, like a blanket woven from honesty and unfinished thoughts. The watcher moved to the far wall. She touched it with her nose. A map appeared not inked, but revealed like condensation, clearing on a glass. It showed the garden, the village, the market of mist, and far to the right, blinking faintly, The field of agreements. Arnold stepped closer. What happens if we go back? You finish what you started, the Watcher said. Not with noise, with stillness. Ellsworth picked up the spiral. Then we go. The teacup rattled approvingly. The tunnel reformed this time, sloping upward. Arnold turned to the Watcher. Will you follow? I already am, she said. And they walked on. The commas winked gently goodbye, and the path curved toward the field. The path led upward through a gently brightening fog, the kind that gave the impression it had recently discovered optimism. Arnold's boots met the earth with soft determination. Ellsworth walked beside him, her spiral held loosely now, as if it knew it didn't need to prove anything anymore. Behind them, the Watcher followed at a distance that was neither close nor far, just appropriate, the way a respectful memory lingers in the background of a familiar tune. The air grew warmer, not in temperature, but in tone, as if the very concept of air had recently received a thank you note and didn't quite know how to react. Then, quite without fanfare, they arrived. The field of agreements stretched before them, a wide plain of gentle green, dotted here and there, with small signs stuck into the earth. Each sign bore a word, a phrase, or sometimes just a well-meaning ellipsis. Arnold squinted at the closest one. It read, "Next time, I promise." Ellsworth approached another, "If I ever see you again." Some were newer, some older. One simply read, "Oh." They walked slowly. Each step shifted the field slightly, as though the grass was politely adjusting its opinion on reality. Birds circled overhead without bothering to cast shadows. Ellsworth stopped at a patch of ground where no sign stood. "This is where I left it," she said quietly. Arnold tilted his head. "Your promise?" She nodded. "To stay. Not forever. Just long enough." He watched as she knelt and placed her hand on the earth. The spiral she held glowed faintly, and from the soil a parchment unfurled, not by magic, but by invitation. It rose gently, settling into the shape of a folded letter. Arnold watched, unsure if he was meant to speak. Ellsworth opened the letter. Inside, in careful script, were words she didn't remember writing, but which she knew were hers. "I don't know what I'm running toward, but I remember what I left. If I return, let it be with roots, not ropes. If I stay, let it be by choice, not fear. I promise this softly, not loudly, so it can grow." The letter shimmered, then slowly folded itself again. Ellsworth stood. Arnold swallowed. "What happens now?" She looked around. The signs across the field began to stir. rising slowly, gently, until they floated in the air like autumn leaves. Reconsidering their schedule, they began to converge. Above the center of the field, the signs spun together, forming a soft spiral. Not a stone this time, but a spiral of ideas, agreements, promises, hopes half whispered. The spiral hovered, then lowered itself. Arnold reached out. The moment he touched it, the field changed. They stood now in the village, not the real one, but the echo. It was dusk. Lanterns flickered. A breeze carried the scent of bread and unspoken questions. The streets were empty, but not abandoned, as if everyone had just stepped away briefly to let the moment settle. Arnold turned. "Why here?" Ellsworth nodded at the doorway ahead. Agatha's. It stood open. Inside the cottage was quiet. On the table, 3 cups, one empty, one half full, and one gently steaming. Ellsworth smiled. She knew. They sat. The spiral hovered above the table. Content. Then, without warning, the watcher stepped into the room. She was larger still. Or perhaps the room had again shrunk to make her arrival more momentous. She looked at each of them in turn, then at the spiral. "This is the moment," she said, "not of endings, but of recollection." Arnold blinked. "What do we need to remember?" The watcher exhaled, a sound like a bell, covered in felt. "You were never lost. You simply needed time." The room dimmed slightly, not ominously, just preparing. From the fireplace, a 4th chair emerged. From the shelf, a 4th cup. From the spiral, a 4th path. It pulsed once, then opened into darkness. Not fearful, not final, just waiting. The spiral hovered just above the table, glowing with a slow pulse that didn't seem urgent so much as insistent. The 4th path shimmered like an idea that had waited patiently at the back of someone's mind for a very long time. Arnold stared at it. It led inward. Not physically. The doorway that had appeared was barely more than a bend in the air, a ripple in the quiet. But it gave off the distinct impression of being deep, like a thought you couldn't quite finish, or a drawer that kept going, no matter how far you reached. Ellsworth sipped from the steaming cup of tea. It smelled faintly of time and unresolved affection. "Well," she said, "this one's for you." Arnold hesitated. "Why me?" "Because this part started with your forgetting," she said gently. And this, she gestured toward the spiral, feels like a remembering. He looked to the watcher. The cow nodded very solemnly. "There are parts of yourself still hiding in the folds of what you chose not to say." Arnold sighed. That's not cryptic at all. No, the watcher agreed. But it's accurate. He stood. The fourth path shimmered again. He stepped forward. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world folded. Not violently, not even dramatically. It simply adjusted itself the way a book closes around a bookmark. Arnold found himself standing in a room that had once been a hallway, or perhaps a hallway that had always wanted to be a room. The walls were covered in sketches, not drawn, but remembered. Childhood windows, doorways slightly ajar, a very specific staircase with a creaky third step. In the center of the room floated a map. It was incomplete, blank in most places, but a red dot pulsed gently near the corner. It read, "You if you're honest." Arnold stepped closer. The spiral floated beside him, silent now, but heavy with intent. As he watched, the map began to change. Lines appeared sketched in the careful uncertainty of someone tracing memory with a blunt pencil. The path wound through his village, the market of mist, the not-yet tunnel, the field of agreements, and finally, into this very room. It was not a route. It was a diagram of remembrance. And as it completed itself, it whispered a single word. Now. Arnold placed his hand on the map. The room shifted. He stood in a memory. Agatha's garden again, but not the broken jar moment this time. This was earlier. A younger Arnold sat alone holding a small box. He looked nervous, as if the box might explode, or worse, speak. He opened it. Inside the spiral, or rather a version of it, wrapped in fabric, hidden, forgotten. Arnold, the present one, stepped closer. "I gave it to myself," he murmured. The younger version didn't see him, but he turned his head ever so slightly, as if responding to an echo. Then the memory folded again. Now they stood in the kitchen. A late night, Agatha asleep in the next room. Arnold at the table, the spiral in front of him. Elswith across from him. Both too young to understand, too old to ignore. "We can't keep it," she said. "But it's ours," he whispered. "Not if we don't know what it does." They sat in silence. Then, without another word, Arnold had stood, taken the spiral, and walked out into the night. That was the night he began forgetting. The map behind him rustled. He turned. It now showed one more point. A blinking circle labeled almost. Back in the present, not present, the spiral flared. The doorway behind him closed gently. The room around him reformed into something new, a study. Comfortable, full of notebooks that hadn't been filled yet. A chair waited by the window. A desk held a single envelope, unopened. He approached it. It read, "For when you are nearly done, not beginning." He opened it. Inside a small note. "Return to the cottage. Bring what you've found." Arnold tucked the note into his coat. The room dissolved like a yawn, and he was back at the threshold. Elswith looked up from her tea. The watcher inclined her head. "You remembered?" she asked. Arnold nodded. "I remembered why I forgot." The spiral spun slowly in the air. The fourth chair at the table pulled itself out. And something behind the cottage stirred. Not a sound, just the sense of a next chapter curling gently into view. The fourth chair, having politely scooted itself outward, now sat empty at the kitchen table. The spiral floated just above the tea steam, rotating with the nonchalance of something that had seen entire civilizations forget where they'd left their socks. Arnold stood the note, still tucked in his coat. The phrase, "For when you are nearly done," not beginning, echoing gently in the corners of his thoughts. Elswith met his eyes. "Well," she asked, though it wasn't really a question. It was more of a nudge in the shape of a syllable. Arnold turned toward the back of the cottage. There was a hallway now. It hadn't been there before, but it also hadn't not been. One of those quiet architectural features that only appears when you're ready to use it, like a back door on a diary. The hallway was narrow. Its wallpaper looked like it had been chosen by someone fond of patterns, but deeply skeptical of bold choices. Each lamp along the way gave off a different type of warmth. One smelled faintly of ginger, another like old library glue. At the end of the hall, a door, simple, wooden, painted with care by a brush that had taken many breaks. It had no handle, just a slot. And of course, Arnold still held the spiral. He raised it slowly, and the slot shimmered. Not magically, just with a sort of administrative clarity. The spiral slipped into place. The door opened, not fast, not loud, just wide enough to allow a memory through. Inside was a room, not large, not grand, just familiar. A workbench sat in the corner, cluttered with unfinished thoughts and wooden tools shaped like metaphors. Shelves held jars of things not labeled, but known dust from the bottom of an old box, a feather from a bird Arnold had once dreamt of being. In the center of the room, a table. On it, a small wooden sculpture of him. But not quite. It was Arnold, yes, but tilted, bent slightly at the shoulders, head angled downward, as if listening to a sound from beneath the floorboards. Arnold approached slowly. The spiral returned to his hand, warm now, pulsing steadily. Elswith entered behind him, quiet as a well-meaning breeze. She picked up a small book from the shelf. "Your handwriting?" she murmured. Arnold peered over her shoulder. The pages were filled with notes written sideways, as if the thoughts had preferred a diagonal point of view. He read aloud, "If I don't remember, tell me this mattered. Even if I forgot, tell me it helped. Even if I left, tell me I stayed for a little while." The room shivered. The sculpture on the table trembled, and then unfolded. Not violently, just politely. The figure leaned back, head upright. Arms opened slowly, revealing a hollow inside, like a drawer of secrets too tired to stay shut. Inside, a small object wrapped in cloth. Arnold picked it up. It was soft, warm. Faintly humming, he unwrapped it. It was a bell, tiny, brass, delicately tarnished, and on the side a single etched word, "Begin." Arnold looked up. The spiral glowed again, and the room around them tilted not physically, but with the sensation of a page turning. The watcher appeared in the doorway. "You found it," she said. "I didn't know. I lost it," Arnold replied. "Not lost," the watcher said. "Just stored. For later." Ellsworth touched the bell gently. "We ring it now." Arnold nodded. He raised the bell. It was lighter than expected. He rang it. Once, softly. The cottage trembled. Not in fear, not in collapse, just in release. Every wall seemed to sigh at once. Outside, the sky shifted color, not to anything dramatic, just a slightly warmer blue, as if the world had taken a very deep breath. The door behind them stayed open. But another appeared. At the front of the cottage, a door Arnold had passed many times, never wondering why it was locked. Now it stood ajar. Beyond it, the meadow. Not the metaphorical one, nor the dream-stitched version. The real one, with real grass, and real clouds, and real birds pretending not to watch. Arnold turned to Ellsworth. "Ready?" She smiled. Almost. And they stepped to the threshold, where one final step waited. But not just yet. The front door, which had once been an afterthought in the architecture of Arnold's cottage life, now stood open in an unassuming sort of way. It wasn't grand. It didn't glow or shimmer. It simply was. And it had been waiting patiently the way well-made bread waits for butter. Beyond it lay the meadow, but not the symbolic one. This meadow had texture, blades of grass that bent convincingly, shadows that stretched with no metaphorical ambitions. The kind of sky you could reasonably trust with a picnic. Arnold stepped through first, his boots pressed into the soil with a sigh. The path ahead didn't curve dramatically or vanish into mystery. It just wandered a little like a stream that wasn't late for anything. Ellsworth followed her cloak, rustling like forgotten pages, rearranging themselves. The watcher did not pass through the door. She stood just inside the cottage, framed by the wood, and the light blinking slowly. "You've done it," she said. Arnold nodded. "It doesn't feel done." "It never is," the watcher replied. "But you've remembered enough to begin again." Arnold paused. "Will I forget?" The watcher tilted her head. "Only if you wish to. But this time, the forgetting will know your name." With that, she stepped back into the cottage, which promptly folded into itself, not collapsing, just tidying, like a letter being resealed. Arnold and Ellsworth stood alone in the meadow. The breeze greeted them politely. Somewhere nearby, a chicken offered commentary, vague and approving. They walked. No destination, no tension, just motion. Eventually, they reached a small knoll. There, beneath a tree, shaped like a good idea that had taken a nap, was a table, and on it, tea. 3 cups. Arnold raised an eyebrow. "Did we plan this?" Ellsworth shrugged. "I think it planned us." They sat. The tea was warm, fragrant, and slightly different, for each of them. His tasted of cinnamon and uncertain bravery, hers rosemary and restored mischief. The 3rd cup remained untouched, not neglected, just available. Arnold looked out across the meadow. In the distance, the spiral hovered one last time, now larger and quieter. It drifted downward, settling into the soil. Not vanishing, just planting itself. "Will it grow?" Arnold asked. Ellsworth nodded. "Only if someone remembers it's there." They sat for a long time, not speaking. Eventually, the sun dipped lower, and the sky turned the color of kindness. Arnold stood. He reached into his coat. The bell, still warm, still etched with beacon, rested in his hand. He set it gently on the table beside the 3rd cup. Ellsworth smiled. They turned together, walking back across the meadow, no longer lost, no longer waiting. Behind them, the bell rang once, not loud, just enough to remind the wind that the next chapter had already started, and somewhere, perhaps in another cottage, or another spiral, or another dream, a cow stirred thoughtfully and settled in again for a well-earned nap.